Bankrupt Pan Am by Bright Sun Films. Full disclosure, I have no idea what the subject is. One of my goals that I would like to do is be able to go into any situation, be able to talk about any situation from a semi-intelligent perspective, even if I don't know anything about the subject. One of those tisms that I have, being able to talk to anybody about anything.
One claims it's the company's only chance for survival.
Okay.
Atari has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The 31-year-old
TWA presents the difference between
Kodak is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
I think I know Chapter 7 and Chapter 10. I don't remember what 11 is.
What's up, guys? My name is Jake, and welcome to the pilot episode of my brand new show, Bankrupt. And abandoned and sometimes canceled, I often like to break down the corporate side of topics I'm on. Honestly, that's because it's something I genuinely am passionate about. That very interest has led me to this brand new series where I wanted to take a deeper look into some of the most fascinating company bankruptcies in history. So in this very first episode, I wanted to take a look at one time the world's largest international airline, an absolute iconic global brand, and one that eventually met its demise in the early 90s. Let's take a look at Pan American World Airways.
So I know that bankruptcy can be used less as an, oh crap, we're out of money, and more as a tactical retreat and reorganization, so to speak. I don't know if that's necessarily at play here, but there are a number of businesses, a number of businessmen who are able to declare bankruptcy to be able to reform in certain ways, potentially not pay off certain debt. Even then, certain debt is non-transferable. There's certain debt that even if you do declare bankruptcy, that you will still owe that debt. I don't remember what kinds there are specifically, but there are debts that can transcend bankruptcy, which is interesting when we start talking about finance.
In 1927, two aircorp majors formed a small mail carrier service called Pan American Airways. After successfully raising enough capital, obtaining landing rights, and U.S. mail contracts, their first historic flight from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba became America's first scheduled international flight. This instantly accelerated Pan American's notoriety and put the company on a path to success as it began a new era for American aviation.
So in the YouTube sphere, this would quite literally be like you're creating another channel. Say you're creating another Warhammer channel or another like Call of Duty channel, right? But you have an absolute banger video that gets like 5 to 10 million views as like your debut video. Sure, you're doing what everyone else does, right? You're doing Call of Duty, Fortnite, whatever videos, right? But because of the way that you did it, it helps skyrocket your popularity. It helps skyrocket your presence in the public eye. You get that attention on you. That's at least the modern comparison I would make to this.
Some mergers into Pan American, visionary Juan Trippe took the helm of the company and immediately began appointing pilots to start scouting air routes in the Caribbean. And this became the basis for all other aircraft to follow. Other key executives were hired to ensure the airline's quality and care, with major changes like prohibiting pilot smoking. And since the majority of Pan Am's fleet were flying boats, pilots were assigned nautical captain uniforms, which have carried through to this day. The company continued to expand and grow with new routes and more aircraft with what they called the Clipper Fleet, a collection of larger aquatic airplanes which now offered routes as far as South America. Their newly built airport in Miami, where these planes were based, became the busiest marine terminal in the world. By 1935, the airline became the first to fly across the Pacific to China, a feat heavily commended. The airline's innovations continued to excite with each passing month, with brand new aircraft, routes, and major game changers like the innovation with land-to-air radio navigation. Pan Am also developed long-range aviation weather services, new aircraft with more efficient propellers, and enormous leaps in the industry, like being the first American airline to establish airport-to-plane air traffic control systems. But perhaps most notably, Pan Am became the first airline to fly around the world. Following World War II, competition grew much stronger with emerging airlines like TWA and United. However, this didn't slow down the airline's innovation and growth. Domestic and foreign flights were added, along with the company continuing to order new planes, helping popularize Boeing's DC-4, which made flying a little more affordable with the new aircraft. Through the coming years, Pan Am continued to be competitive in the airline market, still gaining value and continuing its presence of quality and comfort.
So I'm trying to figure out how this is structured because it's not run on sentences. There are clear paragraphs here. If we talk about innovative, right? Innovative definitely being a word to describe Pan Am, especially early Pan Am. Talking about the ways it innovated, going to Cuba, being able to be the first airline company to fly around the world. A lot of innovative, first to use ground to air radio tech, right? Commercially, right? All of these innovations. It feels like this company was ahead of its time, or I guess a more apt modern comparison for gamers. I mean, it sounds like early Blizzard, right? We're talking Diablo 2, StarCraft, right? We're talking like actual Blizzard, right? Back when Blizzard was banger. And so obviously we saw a tonal shift from that into talking about certain features that the plane offered, going on beyond that. Like, there's clearly a structure here, and it is a history lesson. I understand where that's coming from. I'm trying to so the way that it's edited is it feels run-on sentency, but it's not run-on sentency. I think that might be due to algorithm and retention. If I had to say, this is like a fourth wall break, like breaking down how this video is presented. I think it's great for watching from a reaction perspective, which should never really be a consideration, right? There's definitely some issues with breaks, at least so far. But once again, if it's like, wow, your video is hard to react to, that's a skill issue on the reactor's part, right? 100%. I think if I wasn't reacting to this, I think this would be in the same category of like watching Simon Whistler videos or watching Science File, the AI videos, right? Like how it's just that relentless stream of information, but not in a bad way, in a great way. It's growing on me.
By early 1950, the company changed its name officially to Pan American World Airways. In the same year, they ordered more planes and developed their first economy-only aircraft to fly transatlantic from New York to London. By 1955, Boeing had been developing an all-new type of aircraft, with Pan Am signed on to order 20. And in October of 1958, Pan Am flew the inaugural flight of the very first American jet-powered passenger aircraft.
So this actually brings about an interesting question in regards to copyright, actually. So obviously we know copyright's a thing. Obviously we know fair use public domain is a thing. So I have to question because this actually came about in regards to Mickey Mouse, Steamboat Willie, and specifically Steamboat Willie entering public domain. Does that mean that Pan Am, before becoming Pan Am World Airlines, does that mean that Pan Am itself, the old branding, would become available via public domain or usage? Or does branding work entirely differently than concepts and ideas like Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse? I know this doesn't necessarily relate to... I mean, I guess it kind of relates, right? Because if this is in fact a dead company, because I know next to nothing about Pan Am, right? Like Enron, right? Or if you talk about things like Blockbuster Video, I know they're not a dead company, right? But like very small, right? What happens if you are a dead company? What happens to your trademark? What happens to your IP? What happens to your ownership of it? I'm certain someone somewhere is going to own the rights to it. That's just how that works, right? Just because Dead Space is unironically, joke intended, dead, right? I've watched EA kill it like 3 times at this point. It frustrates me. That doesn't necessarily mean that like nobody owns the rights to Dead Space. Copyright versus trademark, someone owns trademark still, and they enforce it, you can't use it. So it is copyright versus trademark. So then it's 2 separate things. If a company changes its name, as long as the name isn't drastic, then the previous name will be retained. So if someone changed Dove Chocolate to like Pigeon Chocolate, they could potentially lose Dove Chocolate. But if they change from Dove to like Dove with a funny little like O symbol over it for like, you know, eccentricity purposes, okay, so that falls under a completely different legal definition then. Just so that generally would probably mean somebody still does, even if the company's dead, own the trademark for Pan Am. Interesting.
This is when Pan American Airways saw an explosion of innovation and growth. By 1960, Pan Am had signed a $115 million lease with a development company to occupy a brand new office building in Midtown Manhattan. This became Pan Am's new corporate office with their enormous logo at the top. The now iconic New York skyscraper was a symbol of how enormous Pan American was becoming. The airline didn't stop with its desire for innovation, though. As Concorde was being developed in Europe, Boeing famously tried their hand with their own supersonic jet, which Pan American had expressed deep interest in. However, that project by Boeing was killed off due to budgetary issues and for the development of a new wide-body carrier. This was actually partially born from Pan Am, and as a result, the company was already placing orders. Finally, on January 22nd, 1970, the twin-deck Boeing 747 took its commercial flight for the first time, once again, with Pan American World Airways. This is where Pan Am really peaked, with its new tagline, the most experienced airline in the world. And it really was. In just one single year, the airline had carried more than 6.7 million passengers and had a fleet size of over 150 aircraft, flying to 86 countries.
That's wild to think about. I mean, this is going into 1960s, right? That's kind of wild, especially considering I know next to nothing about it. I mean, I know more about Enron. People like to say finance is boring, accounting is boring until you mention Enron, and then you'll just see him snicker. It's so funny. Like, oh my God, Enron's accounting. How was that legal? But I know next to nothing about Pan Am. I mean, I've obviously heard the name. Its reputation precedes it in certain aspects, but it's kind of wild. It's also another thing of just because you don't hear about something or just because you don't know something doesn't mean that something didn't happen, right? If a tree falls in the forest, no one's around to hear it, does it actually make a sound? Yes, that's how that works. Just because Kip doesn't know the full extensive history of Pan Am and how and why they went into bankruptcy doesn't mean that Pan Am wasn't at one point in the time one of the most prestigious airline companies in the world. Yes, that's how that works. Yeah. It's so fascinating. It's why I love discovering history.
This was a key point in American aviation and Pan Am. So what was it really like to experience this firsthand? Well, I wanted to find out, so I got the very exclusive opportunity to talk to Steve Prisky, a former...
Before we get into that, I do want to offer a little bit of a correction. Except in quantum, if you don't look at a particle, is the particle X or Y? JK, joke's on you, the particle's in a superposition and thus is neither X nor Y, but becomes X or Y when you look at it. I hate quantum. It's one of those things where I look at it, it's like my argument falls apart once we start talking about quantum, and I hate it because I want to smack the particle. Choose what you want to be. Are you a particle or a wave? What are you? I hate it. This is obviously a joke by technicality. Let's get into the interview.
Head flight attendant who had been flying with Pan Am for a decade.
Well, it was absolutely spectacular. I had actually grown up flying on Pan Am. When I was 6 weeks old, I took my first flight on Pan Am when we moved to Brazil, and then later on we moved to Australia, so I was very familiar with Pan Am as a passenger. I'd actually logged about 500,000 miles before I got hired by Pan Am. Pan Am really was a family airline. You know, a lot of big companies, you sort of get lost in the shuffle. If the company's really large, you're just a number. Pan Am was a family airline. It was started by Juan Tripp, and he and his wife used to fly the airline all the time, and they treated all of us employees like we were family. And I think that's one of the reasons that people loved flying with Pan Am so much. Not just the way the corporation treated us, but all of us employees treated each other as family. That's the way we felt about each other. And I think that's why people loved working for Pan Am so much.
Pan Am was the...
So I do think that I still do retain this stance. If a company is outright going to tell you, we're a family here, we take care of each other here, that is a red flag. However, that does come with an important caveat. That comes with a little asterisk, right? I guess if we're talking legal paperwork, maybe a subsection or something like that that offers clarification and errata to that initial statement. If a company actually does treat you like family, if a company treats you right, then fine. Then that's awesome. That's stellar, fantastic. Even there's a huge difference, and that's why I make one of the quotes that I have in my branding of words have power, actions have weight. Because you can say this company is a family all you want, and clearly it's going to suck more often than not. But if you act like a family, if you act in the interest of your employees, if you act in the interest of your coworkers, I think there's something special about that. You can't claim to do that and not do that. That just makes you scummy. I'm there for a paycheck. I come in, I do my job, I leave on time. I'm tired of having overtime, and then I will leave. We're not a family here. So I just wanted to offer clarification that just because a company says they're a family, there is that little asterisk for those companies that do prove to be the difference.
The international airline. It became an iconic brand, not just in the United States, but around the world. During the company's peak, Pan American World Airways was $1 billion corporation, and really seemed like nothing could stop this massive airline. But then, 1973 rolled through, and with it, the United States oil crisis. I've talked about this before on how severe the economic impact was on the country. Basically, oil supply to the United States was limited, and because of the demand vastly overwhelming the supply, prices...
My parents were talking about this. I've heard them talk about it a number of times. It's why whenever I'll talk about, modern issue X or modern issue Y, I cite like, yeah, no, you guys went through the oil crisis. You guys went through U.S. dollar no longer being on the gold standard anymore. You guys went through a number of other incidents in your own rights. Like, just factually, issues did happen. Allegedly, I heard the way people circumvented this was because it was split up by, I think it was odd and even license plates. Allegedly, people were swapping license plates around to circumvent some of the oil crisis so people could get gas. Obviously, that allegedly happened. No one can either confirm or deny nobody actually swapping license plates. Thing to think about.
Shot up dramatically. This was a problem for consumers, as fuel was in very short supply and extremely expensive. But companies who relied on fossil fuels were severely affected by this.
Right.
Jet fuel prices were estimated to multiply by 4, which meant operating costs for just one flight skyrocketed. This was obviously a problem for every airline at the time, but for Pan Am, it was a nightmare. While other airlines in the States flew domestically with smaller aircraft, because Pan Am only flew international on high-demanded routes, the company invested heavily in 747s, adding more and more to their fleet. The thing is, though, these 4-engine first-iteration aircraft were by no means efficient. This meant the already enormous amounts of fuel these jets ate up would be 4 times as expensive as it used to be.
So that's quite literally, if you play like card games, you invested in a certain deck. Like you invest in Yu-Gi-Oh, you invested in Yubel Fiendsmith. In Magic, you invested in Red Deck Wins, right? But then the format ban hammer comes down saying Lamau, Phantom, and Spirit are now just banned. Or Red Deck Win is just banned. Like these specific key cards in red are now just banned. You didn't diversify enough, and you saw that there was the need for high in demand traffic routes internationally. So you went deep on those, you put all your chips in, but then an external force quadrupled in price, and now you're paying more to be able to do your job. It's one of those that, like, I don't really know if the answer would have been to diversify, though, because diversifying is money, right? If I'm playing Eldar and Warhammer 40k, and suddenly I play, I don't know, Deathwatch and Tyranids, and then I go play Necrons, suddenly I'm spending 4 armies worth of cash on the game. Right? That's a lot of money to spend. So then you get into, would it cost more money or less money to diversify? And it might cost more money to diversify for smaller and domestic. It entirely might be. Plus, then you're going to have the competition with smaller domestic flight companies, right? So diversify versus restructure. I mean, that, yeah. This also prompts first generation 4-engine gas guzzlers, right? This prompts there might be a second generation, more fuel efficient option. But what's going to happen with that, right? Boeing in recent years is allegedly a company people will allegedly look out and allegedly say that their quality is allegedly subpar. So take with that information as you will. I wonder how this ties into modern Boeing business practice. Allegedly, of course.
Enormous aircrafts were also barely ever full during this time, just adding to the substantial losses. This, coupled with the older, less efficient, smaller planes, raised operating costs through the roof. The slowing economy also resulted in less people traveling, and Pan Am's gigantic infrastructure was starting to become a little too bloated to finance.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that if people have money, they will just spend money? If people don't have to worry about bills and exorbitant prices for eggs, they will just spend their money traveling and doing things? No, that's too weird, man.
Financially sustain. Cuts began to be made in the airline's workforce in a company-wide turnaround effort. While the oil crisis took its financial toll on the airline, with around $364 million in losses and over $1 billion in debt, by 1970.
That's $1 billion in back then money. That is literally more today, though. Like the meme, right? That's literally more today. 1970s, $1 billion in debt is so much more than $1 billion in debt today.
1977, Pan Am regained its profitability. However, it would be permanently scarred by what happened. By the late 70s, competition was growing on the company as new airlines creeped in with market share, and Pan Am was attempting to gain it back. After a poorly handled merger in 1980, Pan American's financial situation had worsened. The company's CEO had decided it was time to sell off some of the airline's assets to stabilize their finances and get the company back on track. Pan Am sold their lease and their Manhattan head office to Metropolitan Life for around $400 million, and the company sold off their hotel chain, the Intercontinental. While their core financial situation didn't recover as well as they hoped, the airline was making an effort to grow and stay competitive with the order of new Airbus A300s and A310s to replace their aging and costly 727s. The idea was that this investment would reap long-term improvements now that operating costs are decreasing. In 1985, Pan Am's CEO made the substantial decision to sell their entire Pacific division, which encompassed 25% of Pan Am's routes, to United Airlines for.
I mean, at a certain point, if you have to sell off assets, you have to question to yourself, are you going to have your operating costs? Are you going to be able to stabilize your situation enough to be able to still operate in at least some capacity to be able to eventually make profit again? Or is this just step-by-step liquidating the business? I think that if we're doing a step-by-step liquidating the business, I think that the writing's already on the wall and that this is definitely a fault of incompetent management. I think that when we start looking at why the gas crisis was a thing, I don't know enough about it personally, so I can't speak authoritatively on it. How much of this was preventable? How much of this was reactive versus just, we're not going to do anything about it? It seems like it was less reactive and more, it's costing 4x for fuel. Kind of hurts a little bit. So external influences, as it were, bearing down to just beat down a company into debt. But I don't know enough to really say one way or the other if this is management doing their best and trying to stabilize, or if this is just step-by-step liquidation. I don't think we can necessarily, at this point in time, as someone who doesn't know anything about it, I don't think I can really dismiss that second half.
$750 million. This, of course, was a further attempt to recover their increasingly dire financial situation and to pay off some of their debts.
Right.
However, to gain back some of its market share, the airline licensed out its name to smaller regional airlines and even acquired one to service out of their New York hub. However, the airline had been plagued by several terrorist attacks, and in the Ukraine, the Chernobyl disaster had just taken place. This, among other factors, deterred much of the public from traveling to Europe. Not great for Pan Am now that they were focusing heavily on transatlantic flights. By 1988, the company's CEO had been replaced and immediately began refurbishing older aircraft. This was until December of 1988, when another very public setback would haunt the company. Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747, was flying at 31,000 feet over the town of Lockerbie, Scotland, when a bomb concealed inside a suitcase towards the front of the aircraft exploded. The blast penetrated the fuselage, causing the enormous aircraft to break up mid-flight and rain down over Lockerbie. The disaster killed all 259 people on board and 11 people on the ground.
It's really odd to think about, because we were actually talking about this at SCA, because we just talk about stuff, right? They were talking about how, back in the 1970s, you could actually just go out on the tarmac. You could just go out be next to planes, and occasionally you'd have somewhere someone would hold up a plane for a little bit of time, demanding ransom money. And you try to think about, would that happen today? Absolutely not. I mean, you have TSA pulling people aside. You have what is it? You have sorry, I got lost on joke about TSA pulling over someone like Mudahar. You walk into the cockpit too. Exactly. Yeah. Like, I mean, I was born in 95, so this is before my time, but like being able to go back and hear that this was a thing, it's night and day, considering, once again, whatever your thoughts on it, factually, 9/11 was a very large event in modern U.S. events. It had an impact so great that it affected 20 plus years of foreign and domestic policy, right? None of which I'll get into, but I'm citing that because of incidents like this. That's why we have a lot of restrictions, why we have a lot of TSA-isms today, where in 1970s, you could just go say hi to the pilot, or you could just go out to the plane. And a lot of this is just external macro factors and how and mentality and how people operate that changed a lot of this. And you definitely know that there's going to be people that will hear this event happened, right? This Lockerbie event happened. And it will definitely affect Pan Am. If we can have Corona the beer be affected stock-wise by a virus, right? That's telling about people and perception. Once again, the BK versus McDonald's. Why did the McDonald's quarter pounder succeed where the BK third pounder didn't? Because 3 less than 4. That's not how that works. Stop it. You go back to school.
I was dating a new hire stewardess named Jocelyn Reyna that was based out of London. And on December the 21st, I was laying over in San Diego. I was doing West Coast shuttles. And when we went out to the airplane the next morning, we're sitting in the terminal waiting for our plane to board, and a gate agent comes over to us with this long list. And he says one of our planes just went down. And so, of course, we're all crazily perusing the list, looking for names of people that we might know. And, of course, it was Pan Am 103 that had just gone down. There's supposed to be 12 flight attendants on an airplane, on a 747, 10 stewards, stewardesses, and 2 pursers. This crew had 13 names on it. The last name was added in pencil, and it was my fiancée, Jocelyn Reyna.
This wasn't the first time Pan Am had been involved in a major accident either. Back in 1977, while in the Canary Islands, a KLM 747 struck a Pan Am 747 on the runway. The disaster.
But like, is that necessarily their fault though? Like that's the thing that messes with me. Like, if it's physically not your fault, right? That somebody goes up and commits the funny T word, right? Is that your fault? If another plane hits you, is that your fault? I'm not saying, and I'm not trying to detract from the tragedy of these events. There's clearly tragedy here. If it's not your fault and you're being punished for it, is that just? I don't think it is. And I also don't know from this event what the follow-up on the other plane was. Like, that's wild to think about, because these things like this happen more often than people like to admit, where someone can do everything correctly, but still just absolutely be left holding the bag, even though it's not their fault. You can do everything correctly, and other people not doing things correctly will get you in trouble. It's I have that neurodivergent sense of justice. It rubs me the complete wrong way.
Disaster killed 583 people, which still to this day remains the deadliest aviation accident ever. However, this time with Flight 103, Pan Am would be a blame for the accident. The US government found the airline guilty of willful misconduct with lax security screenings. The FAA charged the airline with 19 accounts of security failures, and a civil lawsuit was filed from the families of those who died, seeking $300 million in compensation from the company.
I think that, yes, from the legal standpoint, in regards to duty of care, I think that absolutely does hold up, right? Because by that logic, I get roundabout way, something, company, toxic waste, dumping into river. Is it necessarily their fault when they're following the law to the letter? Yeah, you literally dumped toxic waste into this river and it affected this population downstream. We're going to hold you accountable for this, right? But under the logic that I stated, right, is it necessarily your fault? That could be seen as, well, no, it's not our fault because we were doing everything completely legal, and this was just a consequence that was not foreseeable. And this is why lawyers have to look at the world through a different lens. This is why I will often add a asterisk at the end of certain statements. Because at surface level, why is the apple red? The apple is red because the apple is red. Certain things apply. But if we're talking about something at a deeper level, why is the apple red? Okay, well, the apple is red because of X, Y, Z. Philosophically, the apple could be... When you want a deeper discussion or clarification points or even paradoxes within it, sure, that's why the asterisk exists. But generally, that surface level statement is what most people need and or want.
Obviously, this very public, horrible disaster did not reflect well on Pan American.
No.
And given their already rocky financial situation, their now tarnished safety record was a crucial blow. By now, the company was struggling along, looking for a possible merger or a buyer to bail out the company of its ever-increasing debts. In August of 1990, the final blow to the company came with the start of the Gulf War. This completely deterred Americans' desire to fly internationally, and especially now with Pan Am focusing heavily on transatlantic-only routes, this was an enormous blow to their profits. Pan Am was losing money drastically. The airline immediately cut back on all non-essential costs to outweigh the enormous losses, and the company's long battle with debt reached a long-feared point. Pan American World Airways was no longer able to sustain itself, and finally, on January 8th, 1991, the company filed for bankruptcy. With all of these major hits to the corporation, Pan Am just couldn't recover. It's estimated that the airline's financial situation had been so awful that they had been losing up to $3 million a day. So, as Pan Am attempted to reorganize, Delta Airlines stepped in and purchased a huge chunk of their remaining profitable assets, totaling around $416 million. They also took 45% control of the company, as the restructuring plan was going to allow Pan American to operate out of Miami at a much smaller capacity with a fleet of only 60 aircraft. However, by the end of the year, Pan Am was still sustaining heavy losses, and Delta...
So when we talk about Lockerbie being Pan Am's fault, with the Tenor Life is the ATC's fault. I mean, yes, absolutely, both had the impact on that. I think that logic starts to falter a little bit because it doesn't apply to every single instance. If we're talking about medicine, right, like malpractice insurance exists for a reason, right? Or in medicine, it's okay if something is wrong. So for example, if I happen to be John Doctor and you came to me, John Doctor, and I prescribed you, I don't know, say Ritalin or something like that, but Ritalin was absolutely the wrong call, or Ritalin was just on the checklist of things that I would have to try out, and it clearly had an adverse effect. There's not, I mean, yeah, doctors and hospitals get sued. I'm not saying that they don't. But there's a different interaction there. And I'm far from educated to know how medical lawsuits play out with things like malpractice insurance, especially because medicine in certain aspects can be more soft than rigid. So, especially in mental health services, right? Where something might be the call to you, but it's absolutely the wrong decision. And then you're, protected by things like malpractice and stuff. But then again, medicine's also incredibly strange, especially with cancellations and stuff. If you try to cancel the day of a medical appointment, tough luck, you're going to pay a fee. But when it comes to the medical side of things, if you're a medical professional and you just call in that day, even if it took you 4 months to get an appointment, they can call in. There's no duty of care to the patient at that point. With medical law, don't even sue the doctors at fault. You always sue the health authority. It's interesting to think about. I wonder how lawsuits against medical personnel rather than an institution would change the landscape. But we're getting into the weeds here. We're getting into a completely separate topic altogether. I'm curious what happened with the air traffic controller. I feel in modernity, and this is based on nothing other than a dingus opinion, in modernity, the ATC might get a slap on the wrist, right? But I mean, yes, that does impact Pan Am negatively.
As the majority shareholder, had decided to pull the plug. On December 4th, 1991, Pan American World Airways ended all operations.
Wow.
Well, when I started flying in 1979, it was a rumor that you heard all the time, we're going broke, we're going broke. I heard that from day one when I was hired in 79. You know, the company had been struggling, as you mentioned, financially for 3 years before the very end. And so what they were trying to do is entice a bunch of us A-scalers to quit. And they were hiring B-scale flight attendants, people for less than half what they were paying us, to replace us. So a whole bunch of us took advantage of the early out, as they called it. And so many of us retired in 1989, 1990. Of course, we were all counting on getting flight benefits, medical benefits, and our retirement pay.
Right.
So one morning, everybody wakes up in 1991, and nothing. Everything came to a grinding halt. Our retirement pay gone.
Really?
Of course, all of our flight benefits, medical benefits, all gone.
That's the part that I can't stand. Because absolutely, I mean, there's people like my grandfather on my dad's side who worked at a company for 40 years, right? He does his time, and he has his benefits, he has his pension, stuff like that. But we've seen, there was a trucking company in the past couple years that went bankrupt. People had been in that company for 30 plus years, and all of their benefits, all of their retirement stuff were just Thanos snapped. That's not fair to anybody. Especially when, you know, you have this overarching viewpoint of like, well, you know, you just need to get into a good company. You need to do your time for 40 years, put your time in, and the company will just pay for X, Y. That's more often than not anymore not the case. Not mentioning that management, especially incompetent management, makes it harder in a lot of industries to want to stay in that for 40 years, especially if you're not promoted and mediocrity is promoted regardless. Like, oh God, I can't stand it. Like, this is one of those that, like, financially, yeah, the business couldn't support it. But at the same time, is the business not at fault for, one, lack of duty of care, not only to passengers, but also their employees? And two, I mean, knowing a worsening financial situation, could they have done more? Maybe that's a rhetorical question. Maybe they could have done more. Maybe they couldn't have. But, like, at the end of the day, you are affecting the man on the ground. You are affecting your average worker. They now have nothing. It has been Thanos snapped into the ether because of this.
Instantly. So it was a pretty devastating event when it happened, not only for the people still flying, but for many of us that went already retired, expecting that the company was probably going to continue in business even though it was struggling. It was quite a shock to everybody.
The 64-year-old company, the icon of international aviation and the world's most experienced airline, was finished.
Wild.
By the mid to late 90s, all of Pan Am's assets had been sold off, including, perhaps most iconic and valuable, their name. The brand since has been brought back a few times as airlines, none of which still exist today. The name does, however, live on as Pan Am Railways, which still does operate today. Pan American World Airways really was just caught in the wrong time. While negligence and mismanagement did contribute, I think a former vice president of Pan Am says it best. What could go wrong did. No one who followed one trip had the foresight to do something strongly positive. It was the most astonishing example of Murphy's Law in extremis. The airline was just plagued by one disaster after another. Every financial hit it took brought it further and further into debt, while still continuing to provide the service and quality Pan Am was known for. Though, the airline is certainly not forgotten. We did get ABC's Pan Am, which in itself didn't really work out either. However, while I was doing research on this company, I discovered an enormous community of aviation enthusiasts and former employees who build communities and events to meet and reminisce. You don't really ever see that kind of passion towards a corporation anymore. And I think that stands today as a true element of how powerful and iconic Pan Am was to the world. Pan American was the golden age of aviation. The company arguably did more for the industry than any other airline, and it was the first to bring forward new and exciting forms of travel that are commonplace today. While obviously I never flew on Pan Am, well, honestly I've only started flying last year, I think it's absolutely incredible that such a well-respected, enormous company could see a fate like it did. It was truly the final flight for the most experienced airline in the world. If you want to help support and fund this show and my other projects, please consider donating to us on Patreon. A link will be in the description below. Anyway guys, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, and thank you very much for watching.
Leave the train on the track.
I think that was an absolute banger. I liked it. There was a lot of information presented in a very what's the word I want to use? A very time-respective way, right? Like, it didn't try to drag out points. It talked pretty consistently, talked pretty quickly, right? So, just things like that, things that I thought were very interesting, especially because I don't have any history with Pan Am personally. It also showcases, what is it? It's over in Europe. Is it Ryanair? I hear a lot of memes coming out of Ryanair, or Ryan Airlines, or whatever it's called. I can never remember the name. It also is the suffering from success, and if you are someone or something who is doing good, you're easier to take down than somebody who isn't. Now, allegedly, I have to say that allegedly there are memes and jokes and alleged things wrong with Ryanair. Allegedly, of course. But if something is said about Ryanair versus something said about Pan Am, especially with the golden era Pan Am reputation, who necessarily takes the hit? If you say something against someone like Logan Paul versus someone than say like Matt Pat, right, from Game Theory, who would be more affected? And I think that becomes an interesting analysis in itself, where even if you are doing good, if you are something who is being the difference, are you easier to take down than somebody who just doesn't care, or allegedly doesn't care in the Ryanair example, or has a certain reputation over someone like Pan Am? It's interesting to consider, especially from the financial standpoint. And I mean, I think this is the example when people talk about the funny boomer word, right? When you hear people talk about that, I think that they mean this, right? They want the company environment that Pan Am had. Like, there's people who still, like he said, reminisce on Pan Am, and this is a corporation treating people like family, not, oh, well, you're a family with us, and they just treat you like crap. Like, there's a large difference. And this is the rule. Sorry, this is the exception rather than the rule. So, interesting things all across the board here. I thought this was very interesting. You should definitely go check out Brightson Films in the description down below. I made sure to link the original video as well as the original channel for you. I thought this was incredibly insightful, informative, and honestly rather enjoyable. So thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you all in the next one.